started again. I'm glad everybody is joining us today, and let's get after it. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Good morning. I did want to bring everybody's attention that we received a letter from Judge Hidalgo that we'll be sending out requesting certain reports from this task force, either by a bi-weekly or monthly basis. I'm gonna kind of give you a quick rundown of what's the kind of the stuff that she wants. But again, we'll be sending that out, I guess, Claire, as I am speaking. So one on a bi-weekly basis, she wants us to provide an up-to-date data snapshot of the status of evictions, which could include current number of eviction filings, changes in filings over time, and comparisons with other benchmark jurisdictions, and chart the impact from week to week of the recent federal eviction moratorium through data showing, for example, whether Harris County is compliant with the moratorium, and document why evictions are still occurring. On a monthly basis, she asked this group to analyze data and metrics on the broader housing stability system in the context of COVID-19, including unemployment rates, homeless service usage, available affordable housing, Section 8 voucher usage, and availability of low-income tax credits. Identify national best practices for promoting housing stability during COVID-19, and also provide recommendations for potential next steps to restore long-term housing stability for Harris County residents, especially in rent becomes due when eviction moratoriums have ended. So the judge has given us a lot of work to do. And so with that being said, let's proceed with the meeting. Stephen?
Thank you, Judge. And we will, Claire will be sending out to everybody the letter, and obviously a lot remains to be determined as to how we're going to effectuate it. But and we just got it late yesterday evening, so that's why we don't really have at this point more to say about it. A couple of just overviews and comments about the agenda today. First of all, this will be different fundamentally than others that we've done previously, because we have not created the space for the small group breakout sessions. I think that's largely because as we were designing the agenda, because we had canceled the meeting 2 weeks ago, we just felt like there was a lot that we needed to catch up on. And so apologies about that, because I know that a lot of folks enjoy those breakout sessions. It's just, I think, in the interest of time, we chose to sort of forego that. The second thing just to note is that we are doing a little bit of an audible in changing slightly the agenda. We're delighted that Ryan Kuhn from Avail is going to be able to join us. And so what we're going to do is turn immediately over to Martha and Jeff to give an overview of 2 of the existing working groups. The third, which Curtis was going to discuss, which is about a new working group, a landlord working group. We're going to actually wait to have Curtis describe that working group until the foundation for that has been laid somewhat with the data that Ryan is going to share with us. So with that, the other thing that I will just announce that's in the category of fantastic news, both Margaret and Diana are on the call and served as members, I think, of the steering committee that was the COVID-19 fund. And we received word earlier this week that they are making a grant of $300,000 to support the work of the facilitation proposal that Jeff will be describing in more detail later. So that will become a very important and immediate work, and we're just very grateful to the folks who structured the fund, that they have both invited the proposal from us initially, and then were so generous in contributing what I think is going to be a significant amount of funding to allow us to get that pilot up and going relatively quickly. So with that, I will turn it over to Martha and Jeff, who are going to describe the current working groups that they're leading.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephen, and good morning, everyone. As Elaine pulls up our presentation, I want to thank the Rent Assistance Work Group members for their continued work and ongoing work. If you would move on, Elaine, to slide 2 and 3. We have had a change in our working group members. We've added Elena White from Connective to that group, and I think she brings another perspective that will be very, very helpful. I'll just emphasize again that this is a group of landlords, providers, and advocates, which makes for a very fertile ground for discussion. Go ahead and move on the slide. We are towards our 8th week, and we'll be moving on next Friday with another meeting. In the past couple of weeks since we last met as a group, the Rent Assistance Work Group has continued to pay attention to proposals that are coming across from the city and the county, hearing both from about new programs. We heard from Catholic Charities and their work with the county to issue direct assistance, and provided feedback to that, and particularly on program accessibility and the issue of making this available to all, including the undocumented. We have also continued to hear updates from Renee Solis and Baker Ripley and their programming and how that's working. And we'll hear as a group at the task force today on that agenda further from Renee. It's some very interesting data that they've collected. We have also spent some time reviewing the CDC order to temporarily halt evictions. And if you'd move on to the next slide. We really spent quite a bit of time learning about the order itself, and discovered we were all very concerned about the lack of clear guidance. And I know the Texas Supreme Court has addressed that to a certain extent. Concerned about tenant behavior during this period, the lack of clear guidance about rent collection during the order. We're particularly concerned about the state not having a cap on late fees and what kind of debt that might increase for our tenants. And the fact that this moratorium is not tied to any kind of rent relief measures that would help to mitigate future tenant displacements and the stability of rental properties. If you go on to the next slide. We would love to see a combination of rent assistance as well as landlord capital. And I think that's part of what's brought about our new work group that you'll learn about later on. And to protect both landlords and tenants from bankruptcy. A lot of tenant education that we felt was necessary, as well as landlord education, and to make sure that our city and county are well aware of what this really means for landlords as well as tenants. And the last slide, we do have a meeting next week, and we have received another proposal. This one's from the Texas Policy Lab with an innovative proposal for helping landlords pay or helping tenants pay back rent by basically buying that debt from the landlord. So we'll be reviewing that in the future. And I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Well, thank you, Martha. So I'm going to talk about the Access to Justice Working Group. And here's the membership of our group. And just like Martha's, we've got a mix of folks from providers to tenant advocates and also landlords. So if we can go to the next slide. So when we thought about where this focus of this committee really should be, it was about how do we help people upstream, right? Because we know there are the legal service providers who are doing that work. So the two things we thought about is how do we develop a facilitation model, and which Stephen mentioned, we did have, we were asked to submit a proposal, and the proposal's been funded, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But also, could we do a unified, centralized portal which has all sorts of information around the eviction process, rehousing. Information is key during times of crisis. So we wanted to make sure that, people have very clear and concise information. So we actually have a plan for the portal, and I've worked with Connective and Jeff Reichman at General Advisors, and that is right now sitting with the county, and we're hoping to get word on that so we can actually get that work started. The other thing, and just like Martha's group, we focused on how do we get information out about the CDC moratorium. And on our last working group, we worked with Houston Volunteer Lawyers and South Texas College of Law. And what we've been focused on really is trying to get the information to the organizations that work with vulnerable tenants. The information needs are overwhelming, but we think if we can hit the right systems, we can cover a lot of ground. And Houston Volunteer Lawyers has been offering webinars really targeted toward the advocates and nonprofits so they can make sure that they have the information to pass on to their clients. So let's talk a little bit about the facilitation grant. So we can go to the next slide. Next slide. So again, everything we heard is that we should try to help people upstream, because once the eviction process starts, that ball gets rolling, it's stress, it's money, and it's hard to get out, but it is difficult. So we thought about how do we work with our existing service providers who are actually doing rental assistance. And one of the things that happens now is if you call one of these organizations, the first questions you'll get asked is, do you have a notice to vacate? And if the answer is no, the answer for you is, well, call back when you have one of those. So we thought about how do we intervene on an earlier scale. And what we've come up with, and a lot of this is based on what we learned from the focus groups that Connective held, is that landlords want to hear from tenants early, but tenants are often worried and afraid and don't know how to have that conversation. So this pilot project we're doing is really about coaching, facilitation, and negotiation for those tenants who may not have that notice to vacate, but need some help talking to their landlord. And I believe we have the right partners. We have the Memorial Assistance Ministries, and these are folks who do rental assistance every day. So we're actually going to be challenging some of the models that they use and evaluating it as we go. And I think this is even really important because by January 1, when the CDC moratorium expires, I think we'll have information if this actually is an effective approach. And one important thing I didn't mention is attached to the grant we received from the COVID Relief Fund, there's $127,000 in direct rental assistance. So it's more than just helping the conversation, but actually acting as that financial bridge to make sure that clients can either stay housed or possibly, as important is that they can leave on an agreed upon date, again, avoiding that eviction. So if we can look at the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about some of the outcomes that we're looking for. So just about the process, we have been talking about this. We were invited to apply for the grant, and then we made sure that this grant really matched all of the guiding principles. And as you know, we received notice that we did get the grant money. So again, we're thinking about the 3 different levels and what's appropriate for whom. So we're looking about trying to look at reduce the number of evictions. We want to have cost burden tenants have an additional option when they're struggling to pay rent. And we're also really thinking about how do we help folks who, it's beyond just a rental payment, but it's a legal issue. So we have to make sure that we have direct connections and the folks speaking with tenants really know when a legal referral is appropriate and making sure we have a warm handoff for that referral. And again, everything just as we've agreed to as a task force, we want to make sure that we're doing a rigorous evaluation on all this work so we can take what we learned and apply it to other programs and services in the future. So that is my report.
And I just want to follow up with anyone have any questions or response to any of this work that's been going on? Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Martha and Jeff. So let's now transition to Kyle and Steve, who are going to present on the Kinder Institute's most recent work on estimating the social costs of evictions.
Thanks, Stephen. Good morning, everybody. It's Kyle from the Kinder Institute. I have Steve Sherman with me, and Luis Guajardo is here as well. Steve's going to talk us through it, and I'll thank you, Elaine. So, Steve, I think you just need to give Elaine a heads up when you want to go through. I'm just, by quick way of introduction, Stephen put us in touch with folks at the University of Arizona Law School Innovation for Justice group, and they've created this template for the downstream evictions calculator. And so we worked really closely with them to understand what some of the inputs are, and with several partners here, Jeff Reichman from January Advisors, Kelly Opat from the Harris County Youth Collective, PCIC, and others who I'm probably forgetting. I apologize. But to get local input. So I'm gonna hand over to Steve, who really went through the inputs to talk about it, and then we are happy to answer questions. And I think we've already shared out the memo and methodology in more depth, but Steve, take it away.
So thanks, Kyle, for the introduction. And I think that this was a really good follow-up to the presentation we just saw, because we're getting at what happens when you don't do these sort of targeted interventions. So most of the work here was done by myself. I've been at Kinder for about 3 months now, and Carlos Villegas, who would join us, but this Monday was his last day at Kinder. He's starting a PhD program in California. So thanks everyone for being here and for hearing us out. And you can go to the next slide, please. So that number of 35,000 evictions a year won't be, that's from 2019, and that's not going to be a new statistic to this audience. But it was one of the major findings of our recent 2020 State of Housing in Harris County and Houston report. And for some context, we believe Harris County is actually the leader of evictions nationwide. The only jurisdiction that has more is New York City, and they have just a hair more. And New York City is also made up of 5 counties as opposed to 1, and also has twice as many people and a larger share of renter households. So what we're offering, and in this presentation, and also you can go to the Kinder website, see a recent Urban Edge post on the subject and a memo that really details our methodology, is to do this cost breakdown of the downstream cost of Harris County's ongoing eviction crisis using the Innovation for Justice tool that Kyle already mentioned. So what that tool does, and it's freely available online, there's a link to it on this slide, you input the local eviction numbers, which we had, those 35,000 numbers, and then local cost estimates for different social services. And I'll get into the details of that a little bit. And it will end up calculating an estimate for the downstream social cost of the public and not-for-profit sector of your jurisdiction. One thing I'd like to emphasize, this was on the news and I'll get to the numbers, it's costing us hundreds of millions of dollars. And I'd like to emphasize that these are data from 2019. So it's pre-COVID, before the sort of exacerbated stress on Houston, Harris County's social services as a result of the pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis. So we think that this calculator and these calculations can be used to frame really the tremendous burden that the eviction crisis is putting on these already stressed social services. And we really hope that this can help guide policy making during the next few months of that the CDC moratorium is buying us. So next slide, please. So 35,335 evictions yearly in 2019. And we use that as the base for the 3 different calculations. And each of them has the cost, the fiscal cost to Harris County being in the range of hundreds of millions of dollars, which is a lot of money. And I'd like to kind of briefly describe what is in these numbers and also the differences between those three columns, those three different estimations. So first, there's 5 different sectors that sum up into these numbers, the $200 million number, $315, $340 million. So those 5 sectors, the largest costs that we found were actually emergency shelter costs and juvenile criminal justice costs, followed by child welfare, emergency medical care, and inpatient medical care. Kind of want to emphasize that these are only the easy to enumerate costs of evictions. We don't calculate the broader private economic impact. We don't calculate the impact on school districts, which is also very large. So these are some other things to consider that are actually not in these numbers. And these are the 5 major fields within the I4J tool. And during Q&A, I can actually go more into that, but to sort of briefly explain the three different columns. The first estimate, the first column, the I4J column, uses that University of Arizona eviction cost calculator verboten, which means that we use some non-local cost estimates, specifically for juvenile justice costs and shelter costs. We use some kind of non-local, medical costs. So that's sort of when we used it verboten. And then the middle one, the base one, which was the banner of the headline of our Urban Edge post, that $315 million estimate. We kind of changed I4J's methodology a little bit because we had some better local numbers, but it didn't fit into exactly the specific input they needed. So we sort of augmented the tool to our own needs based upon some numbers we were given by some local service providers. And that yielded a much larger estimate, particularly for the costs of juvenile criminal justice, which are immense. You know, it's expensive enough to incarcerate an adult. It's about 6 times more expensive to do so with a minor. And then the third column, the base plus column, in that case, we didn't change any of the cost estimate inputs, but what we changed was the total number of evictions. So that 35,000 number is only the documented evictions. These are when a case is brought to court and it is ruled to be an eviction. So there's about 65,000 cases brought to the Justice of the Peace Court for evictions, and 35,000 actually result in an eviction ruling. But of that 65,000, about 11,000, we don't really know what happens with them. This is research that was done by Jeff Reichman at January Advisors. So we assumed that of that 11,000, we assumed that a quarter lead to an eviction-like event. So someone sees the notice on their door and they think, okay, we're done, we're leaving. So it's effectively the same as an eviction, even if it's not legally recorded as such. So we added those numbers and got that larger $340 million estimate. And I'll happily answer questions about these differences too in Q&A. So next slide, please. So I think the 3 major takeaways of this, one is that the downstream costs of this crisis are not good, they're unsustainable. And secondly, and related, is that this is not just a tenant-landlord issue. And the costs are not just felt by tenants or landlords. It's something that's affecting all of Harris County residents, not just people who pay taxes for social services, but you think about how when a person who is evicted goes to use medical services at a not-for-profit hospital, those costs are written off and they're probably theoretically defrayed onto paying clients of those hospitals. And I think the third takeaway is that there is some time here, right? This is 2019 numbers. Due to the economic stimulus, the eviction crisis has not been as bad as it could post-COVID, but that we have some time till the end of the year. Next slide, please. So to emphasize, to conclude, these hundreds of millions of dollars estimates, they're coming out of pre-COVID numbers. So this is the outlook is not exactly cheery, but this is also everything we're showing right now is before March, is before sort of a lot of things changed. And to sort of end on a more positive note, these costs are high and unsustainable, but studies done elsewhere have shown that anti-eviction policies have a really high cost savings benefit, or high return on investment. And this can be grounds for future research projects. projects. One study done by a law firm that we partnered with, that we consulted on this project, showed that for every $3 spent in legal aid in eviction court, there was every $1 spent, there was $3 of cost savings. And for $1 spent in Massachusetts in direct tenant and landlord subsidies, there was about $8 saved. So there's a high return on investment here. So targeted investments now can save a lot of public money in the future. And with that, I'll open this up to questions.
Great, and please remember to raise your hand in the lower right-hand corner of the participant box if you would like to ask a question, and I can unmute you. We do have a question in the chat from Curtis. Is it practical to consider the development of an eviction migration mitigation impact analysis to support innovation or intervention impact analysis?
Kyle, I think that this is, whether or not the practicality question, I might defer to Kyle. I do think that that would not be a bad idea. Whether or not the practicality of it is a question I think is a broader Kinder resource deployment.
And I guess, Curtis, what I would say is that seems to align potentially with some of the evaluation projects that Martha was talking about from Texas Policy Lab. I mean, I think it certainly makes sense when programs are installed to try to understand what the direct impacts of those could be. We certainly could adjust the calculator as it is with any outcomes that are coming from projects to sort of at least try to calculate the reduction of costs. And again, I think the challenge with the calculator is that it's a pretty rough estimate. So I just want to be, and I think Steve did a good job of kind of situating that, but it isn't necessarily saying definitively, authoritatively, this is the cost to the county, because there are things that you can tweak. So you certainly could say, we're instituting a program that we think is going to prevent 1,000 people from being evicted, or we know will prevent 1,000 people from being evicted. And we could plug in that reduced number and show you sort of from the calculator, here's what that cost reduction looks like. I think it also would make sense to try to do that in a tailored way for each program and not just through the calculator. I'm not sure if that totally answers
it kind of does. My question was really kind of focused towards this notion that the cost estimator, right, is structured and probably structured in such a way that you could treat it like a scenario modeler, right? And so the interventions would represent scenarios. So no, it need not be a specific absolute number, that it is an assumption set, that you could then begin to make some predictions about what interventions would have a high probability of success, and then follow up on that with the same methodology to evaluate the impact. So that's what I was getting with. If this cost calculator, I'm assuming it's structured not too dissimilar to regional impact modelers, those kinds of tools.
Yeah.
That the methodology for adjusting them is pretty straightforward, and we can make assumptions about using it to do other things. And that's kind of what the practicality question was. Again, not knowing how they structured the model, how close, it is, what the actual tools are you have available and how compatible they are with the tools that they use to develop that. It seemed like you could quickly come up with a fairly robust methodology to support decision-making, number one, and then evaluate the impact of those decisions in terms of the actual effects. So that's kind of where I was going with this in terms of my question.
In that case, yeah, this is something that we have the numbers ready. It's relatively simple and straightforward to make an estimate of, let's say we were able to cut evictions in half, what would the estimated cost be? Or let's say that we're assuming, and this is going to be a chance to answer, Luis already answered John Boriak's follow-up question. So, let's assume that a much smaller percentage of people are using shelter services. It is relatively simple to do that on an ongoing basis using this fixed tool. So to go back to the practicality question, I believe, yeah, with some qualifications, it is relatively easy to tweak these models.
Okay, thank you.
And I kind of, to follow up, John Boriak asked, all move-in dues is assumed that all move into a homeless shelter. No, it assumes 25%. And secondly, is there any assumptions of evictions resulting in families moving in together, downsizing? No. See, there is not these are static estimates, right? Like this is assuming that this extrapolating from most predominantly from studies done in Harris County about expected demand due to eviction. One of the major issues, and this is something that happens a lot, is that when somebody is evicted, they move in with a loved one or a friend who then has more people living on their lease than is allowed, and who then in turn themselves place themselves at the risk of eviction. Does anyone want to, Kyle, Luis, do you want to add anything before I move on to Martha's question? Could you talk a little bit more about the calculator itself and the assumptions behind it? Yes. First, I'm going to do some screen sharing. Okay, hello. So first, if you go to evictioninnovation.org, you can see it yourself. That's one thing. So I would encourage you all to take a look at that. If not now, then later. So I have here
Steve, you may want to go
different.
into. Can you go into the
Full
full
screen?
presenter? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to try to, okay, view, present. Okay. So this has the kind of different breakdowns for each of those 5 rows on this slide: emergency shelter through juvenile delinquency. And we have here the different different numbers that we plugged in for the inputs within the calculator. So we are assuming here 35,000 evictions, except for 38 in the Base Plus model. The 2.88 people per household is a static American Community Survey estimate for average household size in Harris County. The percent needing shelter is actually from a study in Philadelphia. We attempted to try to find a broader sense about, this is the estimate for when an evicted household, when a household is evicted, how many are going to need emergency shelter services. The cost of a one-day stay that came from local coalition for the homeless in Harris County, and the average number of days stayed per year is 63, and that is how we got the estimate per person in the shelter, and that's how we got the estimate of 129 million. That's a really large number, and I think that one of the points that I want to emphasize here is that that might seem kind of off the charts, and I would say exactly. Because the point is that these services can't theoretically be delivered at a high quality needed given the current climate.
And I think, Steve, before you move off the shelter cost ones, Mary Lawler asked a question about the number of people we're actually seeing in homeless shelters, and I think I know the answer. Oh, and Luis just put it in the chat as well. It is over the supply of shelter beds that we have. So the costs are just assuming it would be if you sheltered everyone in a homeless shelter who needed it. So that 25% is the assumption. The number is based on if you had the beds to actually shelter all those people. So it doesn't actually touch on what the outcomes for all those people would be. It is the cost of if they were in a homeless shelter.
Yeah, and I think that this raises an important point kind of approached earlier. This dovetails that nicely. Is that, okay, if they were in a homeless shelter, but they're almost certainly, if they're not outside with loved ones who are then needing to pay this hypothetical $75 a night themselves, and who are likely, because given the economically stratified society we already live in, themselves pressed to pay daily costs and are now needing to take care of more people. So the second, I can go on here, but this kind of, we outline here each of the different assumptions and inputs into the model for the different costs. The second biggest one we actually found was juvenile criminal justice. It is, it costs about $46,000 a year. This is just for processing. This doesn't assume incarceration costs or other costs. Very expensive and to process minors in the criminal justice system, and this whole eviction crisis increases the risk of that happening. I'm going to see if I can. How can I see the chat while in Zoom?
There aren't any new questions yet.
We do have
I see. I
one
got it.
person. Donna had a question in her hand, so Donna, I'm unmuting you if you still want to ask that.
Yeah, I just got disconnected, so I hope I don't get disconnected and that you can hear me. I might be maybe going back 4 slides or so. One of the conclusions that was reached had to do with legal aid for tenants and the return on investment. And I'm curious to hear if there's kind of other comparative research. I know we've always looked at New York City as one of the places where direct representation has really served its purpose in halting evictions, and we are running a right to counsel here in Houston. I'm wondering if you have other comparative research to say which states or which jurisdictions have policies that are working and how we can use that comparative data to support our efforts here in Houston with our new eviction right to counsel efforts.
That study came from Baltimore, came from someone we consulted with at Stout, Reesius, and Reese.